It's Build a Big Podcast. David Hooper here. And when I was a kid, maybe 5th or 6th grade, maybe junior high, I was doing something stupid and I got caught by a teacher. It wasn't just any teacher, it was the principal of the school. But I talked my way out of it. The next day, I was bragging to some friends about what a smooth talker I was and what an idiot the principal was. I was in art class and we had these huge tables, maybe, 3 or 4 kids at a table. I want you to picture this. The art room, it was in a house that was next to the school. My school was in an urban neighborhood, and I guess there was a house next to it or something. They'd bought it, run out of room, made it offices and made it the art room. So anyway, I'm in the house for art school, but it's on the 3rd floor. It's in the attic because they did all their business downstairs, did all the art upstairs. And you had to go up several flights of stairs, very narrow. This is before ADA. It wasn't easy to get to, but it's kind of cool for a kid because you felt you were safe. You're kind of hanging out. And I got my friends there around the big art table, and I kept going on and on. That Then I turned around, and she was right behind me at the top of the stairs. She had come out of nowhere because that's how this thing worked. I mean, imagine going into your attic, and you're right there. Anyway, I turn around. She's right there, and I talked my way out of that. Sort of. Not really. Fast forward to a couple of days ago, I got this episode of Build a Big Podcast with Dave Jackson that I released, and I always download my own episodes. I subscribe to my own podcast because I want to make sure the feed is working. Sometimes I listen, sometimes I don't. Happened to listen to this one, and I'm hearing sloppy edits. And I thought to myself, that's weird. I guess I decided to keep things loose. I'm talking things like filler words. There's a part when I asked Dave a question, and I wasn't clear on it, or I stumbled or something. I asked him the question again. Normally, I would edit those things out. And I'm thinking to myself, man, those are sloppy edits. Then the interview ends, and Dave and I keep talking. And that was my oh shit moment. I knew at that point, this is the raw tape. I think what had happened is I was in the middle of an edit, got distracted by something else. I should have gone back to it. I didn't. It seems like an easy thing to remember, but because this was a 3-part episode, I just got confused. Anyway, back to the tape I'm listening to. The interview ends. Dave and I keep talking, and I think to myself, I hope I didn't say anything bad. And I didn't. Just a word that I'd normally beep out. I said shit. And then Dave said shit. And I also said motherfucker. And then I said ass bitch. And then I said, I think that guy is a motherfucker and a bitch. I'm kidding. But I did say shit, which on this podcast should have been beeped because this podcast is classy like that. Lesson number 1 from this episode. Assume all mics are hot, the message is being broadcast, and everything you say is on tape. But there was a second mistake that I made in that episode too. I completely screwed up the sequence of things. You probably heard something that I call the double intro. This is pretty common. This is where somebody does an interview and they'll introduce the guest. Hey, we got Joe Schmo from blah He's a good friend of mine, and today we're going to talk about blah, blah, blah. Welcome, Joe. You got that introduction. But before that, you've got the basic intro to the podcast where somebody will come in and they'll say something like, hey, I'm David Hooper, and this is the Joe Schmo blah, blah, blah podcast. Today, we're actually interviewing Joe Schmo. He's the king of blah, 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 and joeschmo.com. Here's the interview. You're a sound effect. And then it goes to that previous recording that I just mentioned. Hey, it's David. And so you repeat the same thing. That's the double intro. And it happens usually because people are doing things at a different time. That is exactly what happened with the Dave Jackson episode. Not only was I doing something at a different time that caused me to lose track of where I was in the editing process, because this was a 3-part episode, I had an introduction episode, I had the Dave Jackson part of the episode, and I had the Larry Roberts part of the episode. Things got really screwed up. For this 3-part series, I recorded the one with Larry first, then I did the one with Dave, and then I did the intro episode. But how I released things, how you heard them, was you heard the intro episode, you heard the Dave episode, then you heard the Larry episode. So instead of 1, 2, 3, it was 3, 2, 1. And that's not a huge deal, except that I mentioned something on the Dave episode, which you hadn't heard yet. I talked about what had already happened on the Larry episode that hadn't been released yet. That's another one of those things. It's not a huge deal, but it's worth talking about because when something like that happens, it breaks up the fantasy that the podcast or radio show, whatever you're making, is a well-oiled machine. It's like you hearing a question being repeated again. When you edit that out, it makes the host seem so much smoother. You're like, man, that guy's great on the mic. He knows exactly what to ask. Not in real life. If you heard the mistake, that caricature that you think is real, that's blown. That's lesson number 2 here. Sequencing is important. Remember when you first found out that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father? You're like, whoa, mind blown, right? It wouldn't have been nearly as impactful if you'd known that all along. It's one of those really easy things that we can do in podcasting to make what we do better. For example, if you're going to say it, might as well say it into a nice mic. If you're going to release it, you might as well have the sequence in the way that is most effective. So I want you to think about that as you are recording and releasing your podcast. Little things are what make a difference in podcasting, and focusing on those little things is what makes good content great content. It makes it so much more impactful. It makes you sound better. It makes your guests sound better. It's easier for the listener to consume. So get your sequence right. And if somebody is a keep that to yourself. Thank you for listening. If you want to hear more tips, tricks, strategies on how to build a bigger podcast, grow your audience, better spread your message, get more money for the ideas that you have that you're putting on your podcast, subscribe to this podcast. The way to do that, bigpodcast.com/subscribe, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. You'll see the Build a Big Podcast icon there. I've got different ways for you to subscribe depending on how you listen to a podcast. If you listen to an iPhone, got you covered. One button, you are subscribed. You're on an Android, gotcha, man. One button, you are subscribed. If you want an RSS feed, however you get your podcast, that's basically what I'm saying. bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Do it now before you forget. I'm actually looking to feature other podcasters on this podcast. I've got some other things that are online that I would like to feature you on as well. I've got a blog, social media. Let's make it happen. More details on that coming up on the next few episodes. So do subscribe, bigpodcast.com/subscribe, and I will see you then.